Hey guys, tonight we walk into a world of clay dust, reed pens, dim temple courtyards, and old Akkadian words pressed into wet tablets by hands that have been gone for thousands of years. You sit beside the slow-moving rivers of ancient Mesopotamia, where kings boast laborers, sweat priests whisper, and myths try to explain why human beings are here at all. Some parts of tonight's story are widely accepted history grounded in archaeology, broken tablets, and the habits of real ancient empires. Some parts are interpretation, because old stories rarely sit still long enough to explain themselves plainly. And some parts are calm, what-if imagination, the kind that lingers at the edge of lamplight and asks questions without pretending to settle them. Historians debate the evidence suggests, and certain phrases may point in more than one direction. You probably would not survive this world very well, mostly because the snacks are bad, the paperwork is eternal, and nobody has invented air conditioning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know your location and local time down in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin with the tablet itself. Not a glowing crystal, not a secret metal codex humming in a buried chamber, just clay. Plain, stubborn clay. It sits in your palm with all the glamour of a dried biscuit and all the durability of a tax record that refuses to die. And yet from this unassuming lump come some of the oldest surviving stories about God's labor humanity and the strange relationship between those who command and those who carry the load. Most historians agree that Akkadian texts survive from ancient Mesopotamia in fragments, copies, school exercises, temple archives, royal inscriptions, and literary traditions passed down across centuries. What's broadly accepted is that Akkadian became one of the great written languages of the ancient Near East, used for administration, diplomacy, prayer myth, and royal display. The evidence we do have points to a civilization deeply invested in writing things down, even when those things involve divine complaints, cosmic disorder, and humanity's job description. And that job description, if you read the old myths carefully, is not exactly glamorous either. You are not created in these stories to lounge in a garden and post inspirational thoughts onto the morning sky. You are made in some of the most famous Mesopotamian traditions to work, to carry loads, to tend fields, to maintain offerings, to keep the machine running so the higher beings do not have to do every miserable task themselves. It is in its own ancient way one of the least flattering origin stories ever composed. Happy bedtime thoughts. A careful reading might suggest that such myths reflect real social concerns in the worlds that produce them. Ancient Mesopotamian cities ran on labor. Fields had to be irrigated, canals had to be cleared, mud bricks had to be made dried, stacked, and replaced. Temples required personnel, grain, livestock, record keeping, and constant maintenance. Archaeology suggests that these societies were highly organized and intensely practical. So when stories emerge about gods growing weary of toil and turning to humanity as a solution, one interpretation is that myth is mirroring life. The heavens, in other words, are starting to sound suspiciously like an overworked bureaucracy. And somewhere inside that practical myth sits tonight's first puzzle. If humans are created to replace divine labor, then the story already contains the seed of something larger. Not rebellion, not necessarily. Not some dramatic moment where thunderbolts fly and everybody starts chanting about destiny. Let me rephrase that more carefully. What the story may contain is the possibility that from the beginning, humanity is being trained into a role. First as servants, yes, but servants who learn the tasks, servants who inherit systems, servants who grow used to keeping the world in motion. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the old Akkadian myths are not only asking why humans exist, but quietly wondering what happens when the ones doing the work become the ones who know how everything functions? That's a possibility, not a certainty. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is this: Akkadian literature preserves myths in which divine beings and human beings are linked through labor, order, and obligation. The mist is the larger implications some readers sense in that arrangement. A popular rumor claims that these texts hide a single lost truth about extraterrestrial overseers, cosmic engineering, and a grand replacement plan. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians would not follow it. A more cautious explanation could be that the myths reflect how ancient societies imagined power itself. Those above command, those below serve, and everyone fears what happens when that balance starts to wobble. Still, the wobble is there. You can feel it in the texture of the stories, even before you name it. Gods are not always serene in Mesopotamian literature. They can be irritated, hungry for offerings, divided among themselves, vulnerable to noise, and strangely dependent on systems that sound almost administrative. Humanity is lowly, yes, but also necessary. That necessity matters. Necessary beings tend to become important beings. Important beings tend to acquire memory skill and leverage. Before long, the cosmic ladder does not look quite as stable as it once did. Historians still argue whether these myths should be read primarily as religious explanation, political metaphor, social memory, or some blend of all three. That debate matters because the more literally you read the stories, the stranger they become. The more symbolically you read them, the more revealing they can feel about daily life. Either way, the relationship between gods and humans is not simple. It is a negotiation wrapped in ritual, fear, dependence, and dusty poetry. So picture yourself now in an Akkadian scribal setting. The room is not grand. It smells of damp clay oil, woven mats, and warm human effort. A student presses wedge marks into a tablet, while a teacher watches for mistakes with the kind of patience only possible in people who have accepted that life is mostly corrections. Outside, a city mutters with trade animals, labor crews, and temple business. Somewhere nearby, grain is being counted. Somewhere else, someone is lying magnificently about how much grain there used to be. Into that world comes a myth. Not just entertainment, not just religion. Something more like a tool for thinking. A way to hold the unbearable size of existence in your hands and press it into a shape. Why are we here? Why do we work? Why do the heavens seem distant and demanding? Why does the world feel ordered and yet always on the edge of strain? The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. And these texts, old as they are, seem willing to sit with that uncertainty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. What's documented is the civilization, the language, the tablets, the myths, the labor systems, the cities. What's interpretation is the sense that these stories may hint at humanity growing into more than its assigned place. And the gentle imagination, the bedtime mist around the edges, is this small thought. Perhaps the oldest writers already sensed that if the gods handed work to humans, they might one day hand over something else as well. Not power all at once, not in a dramatic coup. Ancient literature is usually subtler than a movie trailer and far dustier than a conspiracy forum at 2 a.m. But perhaps a role, a burden, a stewardship, a future. You sit with that thought as the lamp flickers over the tablet face. Tiny wedges, simple marks. And yet they hold one of humanity's oldest questions. If you are made to carry the load, what happens when you learn the road better than the ones who first assigned it? That question waits in the clay. The clay question stays with you as the world around it grows wider, older, and more layered. A single Akkadian tablet never truly stands alone. It arrives carrying older echoes, older gods, older city names, older habits of worship and work. Most historians agree that Akkadian culture did not appear in a vacuum, as if it had fallen from the sky one morning, with fully formed myths and a tidy filing system. It developed in deep conversation with the Sumerian world that came before it, and beside it, borrowing, adapting, translating, and reshaping. If ancient Mesopotamia had a favourite hobby, it was inheritance with revisions. So you keep walking backward. You move beyond the Akkadian scribes into the older cities of southern Mesopotamia, where temple platforms rise above flat plains and canals cut through the earth like careful thoughts. The landscape is practical first and beautiful second, though in its own stern way it manages both. Mud brick walls glow softly under heat. Reed beds whisper at the edges of water. Storage jars line cool rooms. Cattle shuffle. Donkeys complain, which is one of history's few true constants. And everywhere there is labour measured and repeated, because no city survives here without constant human effort. Archaeology suggests that these early urban societies were among the first great experiments in large-scale organised life. What's broadly accepted is that cities such as Uruk-ur-Lagash and Nippur developed complex institutions long before the Akkadian Empire stitched wide territories together under imperial rule. Temples collected goods, managed land, directed labour, and stood at the centre of both religious and economic life. The evidence we do have points to a world where divine order and practical administration were not separate categories. The sacred and the logistical were basically roommates who never stopped arguing. That background matters because when Akkadian texts speak about God's work, creation and rule, they inherit a mental world already shaped by Sumerian tradition. The names may shift, the language may change, the literary style may grow in new directions, but the older structure remains beneath the surface. A careful reading might suggest that the Anunnaki stories, as later Akkadian readers received them, were not fixed revelations, but evolving reflections of changing societies. As power passed from city to city, dynasty to dynasty, and language to language, myths also moved. Gods travelled the same roads as grain tribute and political ambition, which is actually quite efficient if you think about it. Why invent a whole new cosmos when you can renovate the old one? One interpretation is that this mythic inheritance helps explain why the stories sometimes feel layered, even inconsistent. In one setting, divine beings seem close to Earth, deeply entangled in labour and place. In another, they feel distant, abstract, almost ceremonial. The shift may reflect religious development, literary adaptation, or political change. Historians still argue whether these transformations reveal changing theology, changing state power, or simply the ordinary mess of traditions piling up over centuries like badly stacked tablets in a damp archive. And that is where tonight's idea begins to sharpen. If myths evolve alongside empires, then stories about the gods might also preserve human anxieties about succession control and relevance. The more cities grow, the more kings centralize power, the more scribes preserve and reinterpret ancient traditions, the more the divine order starts to look like something under negotiation. Not collapsing exactly, let me rephrase that more carefully. Not disappearing, but being translated into human systems. Temples still honour the gods, certainly. Kings still claim divine support. Priests still maintain rituals. But in practice, the administration of sacred order is increasingly in human hands. What if the old myth already carries that uneasy feeling? What if the gods remain important precisely because human beings are becoming the managers of everything once attributed to divine supervision? That's a possibility, not a certainty. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is the simple fact that early Mesopotamian religion and governance are deeply intertwined with human institutions. A city's prosperity depends not only on heavenly favour, but on irrigation works, grain accounting, labour organisation, and political stability. If the gods bless order, humans are the ones constantly patching its roof. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki should be read as literal, non-human rulers who foresaw humanity overtaking them in intelligence, numbers, or skill. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it remains popular in modern retellings because it gives old myths the thrill of secret warning. A more cautious explanation could be that these stories grew out of societies where elites feared disorder, labour shortages, rebellion, and the fragility of power. In that context, imagining divine hierarchies that lean on human service makes perfect sense. And imagining those hierarchies becoming uneasy about humanity's growth makes symbolic sense too, even if the text never states it as bluntly as a modern headline would. Ancient texts are usually subtler than that. They prefer implication repetition and divine grumbling over dramatic press releases. You picture a Sumerian temple courtyard long before an Akkadian scribe copies down a related tradition. Workers move in and out under the supervision of officials. Bread is rationed, wool is counted, livestock records are checked, a priest performs a rite, an administrator seals a tablet, a child carries water and probably wishes someone else had invented weekends. Here divinity is not floating far above reality. It is woven through schedules, fields, storage rooms, and tax-like obligations. The gods own the city in theory, humans run it in practice. And perhaps that practical reality leaves its imprint on later myths. Most historians agree that myth in Mesopotamia often helped explain how order is established and maintained. What's broadly accepted is that creation stories, kingship traditions, and divine genealogies are not random fantasies, but meaningful attempts to describe a structured universe. One interpretation is that these stories also reveal an uncomfortable awareness that structures change. Dynasties fall. Languages shift. Temples are rebuilt. Gods rise in prominence, then settle into quieter roles. The cosmic order is presented as eternal, but the earthly version is always under renovation. That tension may be the real inheritance from the Sumerian to the Akkadian world, not a single message hidden in secret, but a growing sense that authority is never quite as fixed as it claims to be. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know that Akkadian tradition emerges from older Mesopotamian roots. We know that myths were copied, adapted, and reinterpreted across generations. We know that human institutions became increasingly sophisticated. What we cannot confirm is whether ancient readers ever felt in the pit of the stomach what modern readers sometimes feel in these stories, that humanity is being positioned not just as servant, but as successor. If we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, the idea becomes less sensational and more haunting. Not replacement through war, not some grand act of overthrow, just a slow transfer of competence. The gods remain in heaven in myth, in ritual, in cosmic imagination, but the hands on the tools are human, the voices in the archive are human, the stewards of memory are human. And once memory belongs to you, the future begins to lean your way. And once memory belongs to you, the future begins to lean your way. Even if the gods still receive the incense, the hymns, and the very flattering titles, you keep moving through the old Mesopotamian imagination, and now the mood shifts from inheritance to exhaustion. Not human exhaustion just yet, though there is plenty of that waiting by the canal. This time the weariness belongs at least in the story to the divine. What's broadly accepted is that one of the most important Akkadian compositions for this question is the Atrahasis tradition, preserved in fragments from the 2nd millennium BCE and copied later as well. Most historians agree that this text is central to Mesopotamian ideas about creation, labor, divine frustration, and the flood. The evidence we do have points to a narrative in which lesser divine beings perform heavy work, grow tired of it, and eventually revolt against their burden. It is one of the oldest surviving labour disputes, though admittedly the union representatives are immortal, and the complaints are addressed to other gods, which does make the whole thing feel a little above standard workplace procedure. Still, at its core, the problem is familiar. Too much work, too little rest, too much carrying, digging, building, maintaining. In the story, the divine workers labour for long stretches of time, cutting canals and doing the kinds of tasks that ancient Mesopotamian societies understood very well. Archaeology suggests that irrigation systems, agriculture, and monumental building projects demanded relentless coordination and physical effort. A careful reading might suggest that the myth reflects exactly that world, translating ordinary human strain into a cosmic scale. One interpretation is that the gods in these stories sometimes behave like enlarged versions of the same societies that worship them. Hierarchy at the top, labour at the bottom, and trouble the moment the lower ranks decide they have had enough. So the divine workers complain. They do not merely sigh into the heavenly distance and request better wellness policies. They rebel. They surround the residence of the high god. They make noise. They refuse the load. And right there at the heart of the myth is a profound old insight: order depends on somebody doing the work no one else wants to do. The heavens themselves, if we follow the story, are not free from dependence. They need labour, they need maintenance, they need hands. That detail matters more than it first appears to, because if the gods can grow weary of labour, then labour is not some lowly afterthought in the story of civilization. It is the hinge of the whole thing. The fields, canals, walls, offerings and schedules are not decorative background. They are the structure holding the world together. and when those assigned to the labor refuse it, the entire system trembles. Historians still argue whether Atrahasis should be read mainly as a mythic explanation for why humans were created as a reflection of social tensions in ancient Mesopotamia, or as a literary meditation on order and disorder. There is no full consensus, and that uncertainty is part of what keeps the text alive. The solid ground is that the divine laborers in the story are overburdened. The more interpretive ground is what ancient audiences heard in that complaint. Did they hear a cosmic allegory for ordinary toil? A noble explanation for why labor exists at all? A warning about hierarchy stretched too far? Perhaps some mix of all three. And then comes the solution: humanity. The gods in the logic of the myth do not abolish work, they outsource it. You can almost hear the committee meeting. Somebody probably clears their throat gestures toward the problem and proposes creating an entire species whose main role is to handle the difficult daily burden. It is both grand theology and suspiciously recognizable management behavior. When the workload gets impossible, invent a new department. In this case, the department is us. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian creation myths often tie human origins to service. What's broadly accepted is that in Atrahasis, human beings are fashioned so that the gods can be relieved of toil. A more cautious explanation could be that this reflects how ancient urban societies understood necessity. Somebody must dig, somebody must plant, somebody must maintain the sacred economy. Somebody must bring bread, beer, livestock, textiles, and offerings into the temple orbit. The myth gives that endless obligation a divine beginning. But if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another layer begins to appear. What if the complaint of the gods is not just about labor, but about replacement? Not replacement in the loud modern sense, not a secret prophecy stamped clearly into the tablet, not some hidden line saying humanity will seize the cosmos by Thursday. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. What we actually have is more subtle. The divine workers rebel because the burden is too great. Humans are created to assume that burden. A careful reading might suggest that the moment humanity enters the story, a transfer has already begun. Not of worship, not of ultimate divinity, but of function. And function is powerful. The beings who perform the tasks learn the tasks. The beings who maintain the system become essential to the system. The beings who become essential eventually become difficult to imagine without. In that sense, the creation of humanity in Atrahasis may carry a quiet irony. The gods solve their labor problem by creating the very species that will come to populate the earth, run the fields, build the cities, sustain the temples, and carry memory through time. The divine workers rest. Humanity remains on shift. A fringe idea proposes that this preserves the memory of literal superior beings stepping back because they knew humans would surpass them. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it clings to the story because the basic structure is their burden transfer withdrawal. A more cautious explanation could be that the myth encodes an ancient truth about systems of power. Those at the top may appear all-controlling, yet they depend completely on those below. Once that dependence becomes too visible, anxiety enters the room. And anxiety is already creeping through the text. Even before later flowed tensions arise, the creation itself begins in response to divine strain. Humanity is not made out of leisurely artistry. Humanity is made as a fix, a solution, a pressure release valve for a troubled hierarchy. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the mythic sequence of overworked gods and newly made humans. The interpretive part is the sense that the myth understands how unstable such arrangements can be. The imaginative mist around it asks one soft question. What if, from the very first moment, the gods knew that handing off labor meant handing off the future? That's a possibility, not a certainty, but it lingers. You picture the canals again, long channels of water cut into earth under a hot sky. In real Mesopotamia, keeping them clear means survival. In myth, assigning such work means preserving cosmic order. In both cases, whoever handles the mud and the maintenance holds more of the world together than polite ceremony usually admits. The old tablets know this. They may not announce it with drama, but they feel it. The gods grow tired. Humanity enters the field. The work continues, and with every task passed downward, something else may be passing, too invisible as dust settling into wet clay. And with every task passed downward, something else may be passing, too invisible as dust settling into wet clay. You stay with that thought as the story moves from divine exhaustion to the strange and intimate act of making humanity itself. The old Mesopotamian imagination does not always present creation as a clean, cheerful beginning. It often feels more practical than tender, more urgent than decorative. The world is not waiting for a poet, it is waiting for staff. Most historians agree that in the Atrahasis tradition, human beings are created after the revolt of the labouring gods, and what's broadly accepted is that this act is meant to relieve divine toil. The evidence we do have points to a dramatic mixture of sacred intention and earthly necessity. In the myth, humanity is fashioned from clay and infused with something divine through the sacrifice of a god. Different versions and related traditions emphasize different details, but the broad outline is familiar enough: earth, blood, labor, purpose. You begin not as a crowned masterpiece strolling through paradise, but as a practical answer to an administrative problem. It is a humbling origin story, though at least you do not have to fill out an application first. Archaeology suggests that clay was everywhere in Mesopotamia, not only in mythic thought, but in daily life. Mud brick houses, clay tablets, clay ceilings, clay vessels, clay figurines, clay under your nails, clay cracking in the sun, clay softening after rain. A careful reading might suggest that creating humans from clay was not only symbolically meaningful, but deeply local. Ancient listeners knew this material intimately. It was what cities were built from, what records were written on what the river left behind. To imagine humanity shaped from clay is to imagine people made from the same substance as walls, tablets, ovens, and the city itself. You are not separate from the world you must maintain, you are made of it. That detail matters because the myth does not describe humans as distant observers of order. It places you inside the machinery from the start. Clay belongs to the field, the riverbank, the building site, the workshop floor. So, if the gods fashion humanity from clay, one interpretation is that the story quietly binds human identity to labour maintenance and material reality. You are not just alive, you are fitted to a system. And yet there is another ingredient. In the mythic logic, something of divine essence enters the mixture. Exactly how that should be understood is debated. Some readers focus on the sacrificial element. Others see a literary way of explaining why humans can think, speak, worship, and participate in sacred order despite being made for lowly tasks. Historians still argue whether this divine infusion should be read mainly as theology, political symbolism, ritual, explanation, or some combination of all three. There is no full consensus, which is good for bedtime mystery, and slightly less good for anyone hoping the tablet will simply sit up and explain itself. Still, the tension is wonderfully strange. You are made to serve, but not made as mere mud. You are shaped for labour, but with some spark that links you to the beings above you. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian myths do not erase the gulf between gods and humans. The gods remain powerful, immortal, and higher in rank. A more cautious explanation could be that the divine component in humanity exists only to make service possible within a sacred cosmos. But a careful reading might suggest something more unsettling. If humans carry even a trace of divine quality, then the line between servant and heir becomes just a little less clean. That is a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The text does not say, "Congratulations, future replacements." It is more subtle, more ancient, more interested in function than slogans. But function can change identity over time. If you are made from earth and divinity together, and if your task is to take over work once done by gods, then the arrangement begins to feel less like simple servitude and more like apprenticeship under pressure. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the making of humanity is not only the beginning of service, but the beginning of succession in slow motion? We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is the unusual dignity hidden inside an apparently lowly role. Ancient Mesopotamian texts can be severe about human limitations. People die, people suffer, people depend on divine favor. Most historians agree that these myths do not present humanity as equal to the gods, yet the evidence we do have also points to humans bearing remarkable responsibility. Humans feed temples, build cities, preserve names, perform rituals, and maintain the order of everyday life. If the gods withdraw from labor, and humans assume it, the practical balance of the world shifts at once. A fringe idea proposes that this myth remembers an engineered species designed to absorb divine functions and eventually surpass its makers. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it appeals to modern audiences because it transforms ancient theology into cosmic intrigue. A more cautious explanation could be that the story reflects a very old human experience. The lower ranks of society often do the essential work, learn every mechanism, and gradually become the living foundation of the whole structure. The elite may still claim authority, but dependence runs downward more than anyone likes to admit. You can picture the scene with sleepy clarity. Clay laid out in a dim, sacred workshop. The murmur of divine discussion. The weight of necessity hanging in the air. A ritual act, a mixing of elements. The first human form rising not into freedom exactly, but into assignment. You inhale the smell of damp earth and oil smoke. Somewhere beyond the myth in the real cities of Mesopotamia, workers are already kneading actual clay for bricks, plastering walls, shaping jars, pressing signs into tablets. The myth does not float far above them, it leans close. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian myth links human creation to relieving divine labor. The interpretive part is that this may reflect how ancient societies understood social function and dependence. The imaginative part, the soft midnight question, is whether the gods in these stories create humanity with a trace of unease. Not because humans are dangerous right away, but because once a being knows how to carry the world, it becomes harder to imagine taking that burden back. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the myth gives humanity a purpose. We know clay and divine essence combine in a story of service. We know the labor is transferred. What we cannot confirm is whether ancient listeners ever sensed the irony curling quietly through the tale, that to solve the gods' problem, the gods may have made the only beings capable of inheriting their work completely. And if that irony was felt even dimly, then the creation of humanity is not just an origin, it is the first handover. And if that irony was felt even dimly, then the creation of humanity is not just an origin, it is the first handover. You feel that handover most clearly, not in a throne room or a burst of sacred lightning, but in the ordinary places where real Mesopotamian life unfolded. The field edge, the canal bank, the bakery yard, the brick pit, the storehouse, the temple kitchen, the workshop where somebody is already tired before sunrise and somehow still expected to smile politely at authority. What's broadly accepted is that ancient Mesopotamian civilization depended on organized labor at every level. Archaeology suggests that the cities of the Tigris and Euphrates world survived only through constant maintenance of irrigation systems, agricultural cycles, storage networks, and building projects. The evidence we do have points to a society where grain did not simply appear, walls did not remain standing by optimism alone, and temple offerings did not march themselves politely to the altar. Somebody had to thresh the barley shape, the bread haul, the baskets, mix the mortar, clear the silt, tally the sheep, and fix the thing that broke yesterday, and somehow also today. So when myth says humanity is made to take over labor once assigned to divine beings, the old stories do not drift far from ordinary reality. A careful reading might suggest that these myths are powerful not because they describe some distant fantasy, but because they magnify the practical truth of Mesopotamian life. Labor is not background. Labor is the center. If kings appear glorious, it is because thousands of hands support the platform beneath them. If temples seem sacred, it is because endless human effort keeps the lamps lit and the grain bins full. Ancient spirituality, like most institutions, works best when somebody else is carrying heavy things. You step into that world now as if into heat. Morning comes early. The sky pales over flat land and low city walls. Mud brick houses hold the night's last coolness for a few brief moments, like stingy little gifts. Then the warmth rises. Workers move toward fields and canals. Donkeys complain about their career paths. A baker's yard smells of grain dust and damp fuel. Somewhere a scribe sits cross-legged over a tablet and records allocations with the grim dignity of a person who knows numbers are more permanent than charm. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian temples were not only religious centers, but economic hubs. What's broadly accepted is that they managed land labor rations and offerings on a significant scale. One interpretation is that the myths of divine labor and human service reflect this temple-centered world, where the gods were imagined as owners or overlords, and humans as their workers, caretakers, and providers. A more cautious explanation could be that these tales gave sacred meaning to obligations that otherwise felt brutally ordinary. If you must spend half your life knee-deep in mud or bent over grain, it may help at least a little to believe the whole arrangement fits into cosmic order. Though honestly, if you are ankle-deep in canal sludge in summer, cosmic order probably feels a touch under-marketed. And yet that sludge matters. The canals are a perfect example. Archaeology suggests that irrigation was fundamental to southern Mesopotamian survival. Water had to be directed, controlled, maintained, and defended from neglect. Too little care and fields failed. Too much silt and channels clogged. Too much water and land turned troublesome fast. This is not glamorous work. It is repetitive, physical, and absolutely essential. A careful reading might suggest that when myths imagine earlier divine beings burdened by digging canals and maintaining the world, they are giving heavenly form to the very tasks people knew best below. That connection makes tonight's larger question sharper. If humans inherit not just random chores, but the central tasks that sustain civilization, then they are not merely replacing muscle, they are replacing function. Bread, bricks, irrigation offerings, accounting, repair. These are the acts by which the world remains inhabitable. The gods in myth may still receive honor, but the skill increasingly belongs to human hands. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if every loaf canal and mud brick hints at a quiet transfer of competence from the divine to the human? That's a possibility, not a certainty. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist. The solid ground is that human labor was essential to Mesopotamian life, and that myths connect human origins to relieving divine toil. The mist is the suggestion that ancient storytellers, consciously or not, were preserving an unease about what happens when the servant becomes the system's true operator. Historians still argue whether these labor myths should be read mainly as theological explanation or as reflections of social structure. Scholars continue to debate how directly everyday economic life shaped the literary imagination. There's no full consensus, and that is fair enough. Ancient people were capable of symbolism, devotion, practical thinking, and poetic exaggeration all at once. Honestly, they would have done very well on modern internet forums minus the profile pictures. Still, one thing remains hard to ignore. In these stories, humanity does not arrive as decoration. Humanity arrives as infrastructure. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki, new humans, would eventually replace them because they intentionally passed down technical knowledge hidden inside myths of labor and service. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because it attaches mystery to real patterns. The real patterns are already interesting enough. Ancient societies repeatedly show humans learning, managing, recording, and sustaining the structures that matter most. A more cautious explanation could be that the myths reveal how power often works in the real world. Those above preserve authority by handing burdens downward. Yet in doing so, they also hand down knowledge. And knowledge once learned is very difficult to unlearn. You imagine a brickmaker pressing wet earth into a mould. Another worker stacks finished bricks to dry in the sun. Nearby, a woman grinds grain with slow, practiced motion. In a temple storehouse, someone checks baskets against written counts. In a field beyond the wall, labourers adjust water flow with an experience so ordinary it barely seems like intelligence, though of course it is. Civilization depends on skilled repetition so familiar that elites often stop noticing it. Myth, strangely enough, notices. It notices enough to place labor at the beginning of the human story. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the reality of Mesopotamian work, canals, bread, bricks, temples, ration systems, organized labor. The interpretation is that myths about relieving divine toil may mirror this world closely. The gentle imagination is the thought that maybe, just maybe, the gods in these stories begin to fade from daily function the moment humans prove they can keep the wheels turning themselves. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know humans carried the load. We know ancient texts understood that load as sacredly important. What we cannot confirm is whether anyone in the old world ever looked around at the loaves rising, the bricks drying, the canals clearing, and felt the same unsettling thought you feel now. If the gods once did this work and humans do it now, then perhaps replacement has already begun so quietly that almost nobody dares to name it. And perhaps replacement has already begun so quietly that almost nobody dares to name it. You carry that thought with you as the old Akkadian world grows louder, not with triumph but with irritation. The fields are fuller, the settlements denser, the smoke from hearths and kilns hanging a little thicker above the plain. Humanity once created as the solution to divine labor is no longer merely useful. Humanity is numerous, humanity is busy, humanity is noisy. What's broadly accepted is that in the Atrahasis tradition, one of the great tensions that follows human creation is the sheer disturbance caused by human population growth. Most historians agree that the text presents mankind's noise as a major reason the high gods become frustrated. The evidence we do have points to a mythic world in which people multiply, fill the land, and somehow become impossible for the divine realm to ignore. A careful reading might suggest that this noise is not just literal sound, though ancient cities surely made enough of that. One interpretation is that it symbolizes pressure itself, crowding growth demand, unpredictability, the uncomfortable reality of a human world becoming too large to manage from above. And that is wonderfully awkward because humans were created precisely to take over the work. The new staff has been hired, the workload is handled, the canals are maintained, the bread is baked, the offerings arrive, the fields keep yielding what they can. In practical terms, the system is functioning. But now the system has developed a side effect, and the side effect is us. We talk, sing, argue, build, reproduce, complain, celebrate, and drag furniture around at hours that would absolutely make a god question the entire project. Archaeology suggests that ancient Mesopotamian cities grew into dense and demanding places, especially in the south where irrigation agriculture supported substantial populations. What's broadly accepted is that urban life brought administration, specialization, hierarchy, and crowding on a scale earlier villages had not known. So when myth says the gods are troubled by human noise, a more cautious explanation could be that the story reflects ancient anxieties about what happens when successful society becomes overwhelming society. Growth sounds good right up until the storage rooms are strained, the canals need constant expansion, and your neighbours discover shouting. You can picture it clearly. Dawn breaks over a city already awake. Donkeys bray like unpaid philosophers. Merchants set out goods. Potters thump wet clay into shape. Children run where they have been told not to run. Priests prepare rites. A foreman yells at a labour crew. Somewhere a scribe scratches down figures with the intense seriousness of someone trying to make barley obey mathematics. From the roofs and lanes comes the low hum of a civilization alive enough to irritate the heavens. Historians still argue whether the noise in Atrahasis should be understood literally, morally, politically, or symbolically. Scholars continue to debate whether it refers to sound disorder, overpopulation, social tension, or some combination of all these. There's no full consensus, which is fair, because ancient literature often packs multiple meanings into one beautifully inconvenient word. Still, the mystery sharpens when you notice what the noise represents in the broader story. Humans are no longer passive instruments. They are not just performing tasks in silence. They are becoming a force. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The text does not say humanity is staging a cosmic takeover. It says humanity has become troublesome by its very abundance and activity, but abundance and activity are exactly what make replacement imaginable. The beings once created to relieve labour have multiplied into a presence so large that the gods must respond. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the noise that disturbs the gods is really the sound of human importance becoming impossible to ignore? We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is that divine frustration in Mesopotamian myth often appears when boundaries blur. Gods are content while hierarchy functions neatly. Trouble begins when lower beings refuse, multiply, intrude, or become difficult to contain. In Section 3, the labouring gods rebel because the burden is too great. Now, humanity made to absorb that burden creates a new problem by thriving too well. The pattern is almost funny in a dark administrative way. Heaven solves one staffing issue and accidentally invents another. Somewhere in the distance, a celestial manager is pretending this was all part of the original strategic vision. Most historians agree that flood traditions in Mesopotamian literature are closely tied to this theme of divine irritation with human excess. What's broadly accepted is that the gods seek ways to reduce humanity after its numbers and noise become intolerable. A careful reading might suggest that beneath the myth lies a real ancient fear of scale. Cities can grow, families can multiply, fields can strain, systems can buckle. A more cautious explanation could be that divine anger in the text expresses human anxieties about environmental pressure, social stress, and the precariousness of order in a crowded world. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a subtler reading appears. What if the gods are not only angry but uneasy? Not because humans are morally loud in some scolding simplistic sense, but because they are becoming structurally central. They are no longer merely workers carrying out assigned tasks in neat invisibility. They are a mass presence, a living tide across the landscape, difficult to reduce to obedient function. The old hierarchy begins to look nervous. The servants are everywhere. The system now belongs to them by sheer participation. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki feared humanity's future capacity, and that the noise in the texts preserves memory of a species growing beyond intended limits. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because the emotional shape of the story invites it. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient myths often dramatize elite fear of populations that become too numerous, too hard to direct, or too vital to suppress without consequence. In that reading, the gods behave less like mysterious cosmic visitors, and more like rulers confronting the unsettling fact that those below them now define the world's daily reality. And daily reality is stubborn. Bread must still be baked, fields still need tending, brick still cracks and must be remade, offerings still require preparation. The heavens may frown at the noise, but the earth keeps asking for hands. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the mythic complaint that humanity's noise disturbs the gods. The interpretation is that this may reflect ancient concerns about growth, strain, and control. The gentle imagination is the whisper at the edge of the tablet. Perhaps what the gods hear in all that noise is not just annoyance, but the approach of a world increasingly run by human presence alone. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the gods create humans to work. We know humans multiply. We know their noise reaches heaven. What we cannot confirm is whether ancient listeners sense the irony as sharply as you do now, lying here in the dark. The sound upsetting the gods may simply be the sound of humanity becoming too large, too capable, and too permanent to remain just a servant species. The sound upsetting the gods may simply be the sound of humanity becoming too large, too capable, and too permanent to remain just a servant species. You stay with that unease as the story shifts from labour and noise to something more elevated, more ceremonial, and yet perhaps just as revealing kingship. because once human beings are numerous enough to feel the land organize themselves and strain the old balance. The next question is not merely who works, but who rules. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian kingship was deeply entangled with divine legitimacy. Most historians agree that rulers in Sumerian and Akkadian tradition did not present themselves as self-made political entrepreneurs with excellent branding. They claimed in one form or another that authority descended from the gods. Kings built temples, performed rituals, issued inscriptions, led wars, administered justice, and framed their power as part of sacred order. Archaeology suggests that royal inscriptions, monumental building, and ceremonial life all reinforce the idea that human rule was meaningful because it stood under divine sanction. And yet, that very arrangement may hint at something else. A careful reading might suggest that kingship in Mesopotamia is one of the clearest examples of divine function moving into human hands. The gods remain above certainly, the heavens still bless, judge, and legitimate. But the daily exercise of power, the actual management of land, labour law and defence is performed by a person with tired feet, political problems, and probably at least one advisor who should not be trusted with a shopping list. One interpretation is that royal power becomes the bridge between mythic hierarchy and practical human control. In other words, if humanity begins by inheriting divine labour, kingship may represent the next handover, humanity beginning to inherit divine governance. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Mesopotamian kings were not presented as replacements for the gods in any simple or open sense. They remained subordinate, dependent on divine favour, vulnerable to omen ritual and cosmic displeasure. Most historians agree that the divine realm was not erased by earthly rule, but the evidence we do have points to a very human reality. The king is the one issuing orders, receiving tribute, directing workers, overseeing projects, and embodying order in public life. The gods authorize. The human ruler executes. And execution matters. You can picture an Akkadian king standing before a temple facade, bronze gleaming, attendants nearby, scribes ready to preserve every triumph in language more flattering than strict objectivity might allow. The inscription will say the ruler acted by divine will, built at divine command, conquered with divine support, restored what the gods desired, restored. What's broadly accepted is that such statements were central to royal ideology. A more cautious explanation could be that kingship worked by presenting human authority as an extension of sacred order rather than a rival to it. Yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another question emerges. What if that extension gradually becomes indistinguishable from substitution? What if the Anunnaki, or the broader divine order they represent, remain in the background because the visible face of order has already become human? Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian kingship should be seen primarily as priestly stewardship, political theatre, cosmic duty, or practical governance dressed in sacred language. There's no full consensus, and that is not surprising. Ancient kingship was all of those things at once. It was religion administration, spectacle logistics, memory and fear. It smelled of incense and sweat. It sounded like prayer and taxation. It looked eternal and collapsed quite regularly. That regular collapse is part of the puzzle too. Empires rise, dynasties fall, cities lose favour and later regain it. New kings appear with old divine claims. The names change, but the pattern continues. One interpretation is that this reveals the resilience of Mesopotamian sacred kingship. Another is that it reveals its increasing dependence on human institutions. The throne descends from heaven in the old ideological language. But after that descent, everything depends on whether human beings can keep walls, repaired fields, watered records maintained, and armies fed. Heaven may bestow the crown. Earth has to manage the pantry. And the pantry, as history repeatedly proves, is where grand theories go to face reality. A fringe idea proposes that divine kingship traditions preserve memory of literal non-human overlords gradually withdrawing as humans became capable of ruling themselves. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it echoes because the structure of the myths leaves room for the imagination. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient societies often place ultimate legitimacy in the heavens while allowing actual governance to become more and more human, more bureaucratic, and more institutional over time. In that reading replacement is not an act of revolt, but a quiet administrative fact. The gods remain the source, humans become the operators. Archaeology suggests that kings in Mesopotamia were also builders on a massive scale. They restored walls, temples, canals, gates, and storehouses, and they made certain future generations knew exactly who deserved credit. Most historians agree that building inscriptions are a vital source for understanding royal self-presentation. A careful reading might suggest that royal construction is not only practical but symbolic. To build is to imitate divine ordering power. To restore a temple is to maintain the bond between heaven and earth. To cut canals and secure cities is to participate in the same ordering labor once attributed to gods in myth. So the pattern deepens. First, humanity inherits work. Then select humans kings above all inherit representation. The king becomes the human body through which divine order is enacted, or at least advertised. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the divine legitimacy of Mesopotamian kingship and the practical authority kings exercised. The interpretation is that this arrangement may reveal a transfer of functional power downward into human hands. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps the gods in these stories do not disappear because they are defeated. Perhaps they recede because human rulership, once sanctified, begins doing so much of the visible work that the distance between steward and successor starts to blur. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know kings rule in the name of the divine. We know human governance becomes increasingly complex and central. We know the heavens remain invoked even as earthly institutions grow stronger. What we cannot confirm is whether ancient audiences ever felt the quiet irony beneath the ceremony, that every time a king speaks as the agent of heaven, humanity takes another step toward occupying a role once imagined as belonging more directly to the gods. And once a role is occupied long enough, it begins to feel inherited. You sense that inheritance most clearly not on the battlefield, or even beneath the king's crown, but inside the temple compound, where sacred order becomes daily routine, and daily routine becomes a kind of quiet human mastery. If kingship shows humanity wearing the public face of divinely sanctioned power, the temple shows humanity performing its inner machinery with astonishing persistence. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian temples were not merely places of prayer in the modern narrower sense. Most historians agree that they were administrative, economic, ritual, and symbolic centers woven deeply into city life. Archaeology suggests that temple institutions managed land workers' livestock grain, textiles, offerings, and storage on a large scale. Priests, administrators, laborers, singers, cooks, brewers, scribes, and various specialists all contributed to keeping the sacred system alive. The evidence we do have points to a world in which divine order did not hover abstractly above human life. It had accounts, it had inventories, it had regular deliveries, it had frankly more paperwork than any respectable mystery ought to admit. And yet that paperwork may be one of the most revealing clues of all. A careful reading might suggest that the temple is where divine rule becomes human procedure. The gods still own the fields in theory, receive the offerings in ritual, and stand at the center of the city's identity. But the actual handling of their estate belongs to human beings. One interpretation is that priests and administrators function as earthly extensions of divine order, translating heavenly expectation into measurable tasks. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply how ancient religion worked in practice. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, something quietly unsettling appears. What if the gods no longer need to rule directly, because people are already doing the ruling for them, one sealed jar and ration list at a time? That is a possibility, not a certainty, but it lingers like oil smoke in a narrow room. You picture a temple morning. The air is cool for a moment before the day's heat settles in. Reed baskets are carried across a courtyard. A scribe checks grain quantities with that familiar expression of dignified suspicion. A priest prepares incense while another official discusses allocations, and somewhere in the back a brewer is dealing with vats that smell both sacred and deeply practical. The divine statue, dressed and honoured, remains the symbolic centre, yet every visible action is human. Human hands wash the vessel. Human hands sort the offerings. Human hands tally the wool count. The jars inspect the bread. If the God is present, the God is present through a network of people who know precisely how the whole thing runs. Most historians agree that temple staff in Mesopotamia performed a vast range of specialized roles. What's broadly accepted is that religious institutions depended on organized labor and careful administration. The evidence we do have points to temples as engines of continuity, preserving not only cultic practice, but also economic stability and social structure. Historians still argue whether temples should be understood primarily as sacred households, political institutions, economic powers, or all three at once. There's no full consensus because ancient Mesopotamian life had a habit of collapsing our neat categories into one very crowded courtyard. That crowded courtyard matters because it changes how you hear the old myths. When Akkadian traditions describe divine beings, cosmic hierarchy, and humanity's assigned place, they are speaking into a world where sacred order is already deeply human-managed. People know the ritual calendar. People know how much grain goes where. People know which hymn must be sung and which gate must be opened. The sacred system remains divine in principle, but in practice it depends on human memory and discipline. One interpretation is that temples do not merely serve the gods, they domesticate divine presence into forms that people can maintain. And once you can maintain something, you begin in a subtle way to possess it. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Not possess in the sense of abolishing the divine or stealing the sacred center. The texts do not suggest that, and we should not force them to, but possess in the sense of operational intimacy. Humans become the ones who know how the lamps are lit when the offerings are due, how the storerooms are organized, which prayers fit which occasion, and how sacred order is made visible day after day. The God remains the reason. The humans become the method. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the temple system preserves a moment in cultural memory, when humanity has already become the daily caretaker of divine power so fully that the line between servant and stand-in starts to blur? A fringe idea proposes that priesthoods in Mesopotamia inherited literal knowledge from superior beings and gradually learned to operate without them. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it persists because ancient ritual specialists can appear mysterious from a distance. A more cautious explanation could be that temple personnel were simply highly trained experts within a sacred economy, and that their expertise gave them enormous practical authority. Yet even that cautious reading carries weight. Expertise is a form of power, especially when it keeps the center of the world functioning. Archaeology suggests that temples stored wealth, coordinated production, and shaped urban identity in lasting ways. Most historians agree that they were among the key institutions through which city life was organized and remembered. A careful reading might suggest that this institutional role matters as much as any mythic tale. The gods may be supreme in ideology, but the temple teaches a quieter truth. Continuity belongs to the people who perform it. If a festival must happen, humans make it happen. If a god must be fed in ritual, humans arrange the meal. If sacred order must survive drought, war, or dynastic change, humans carry the knowledge through. That is where tonight's theme deepens further. Replacement may not mean banishment. It may not even mean rivalry. It may mean stewardship becoming so complete that the absence of direct divine action no longer breaks the system. The system already lives in human habit. The old labor handover from the myths now looks broader than physical work. It includes administration, ritual, timing, memory, and procedure. Humanity is no longer just building the walls. Humanity is running the house. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the complexity of Mesopotamian temples and their human staff. The interpretation is that these institutions may reveal sacred authority moving into increasingly human forms. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps the gods in the old stories grow distant, not because they vanish, but because their earthly responsibilities have been absorbed so thoroughly by priests, scribes, and managers that heaven no longer needs to step into the room directly. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know temples were run by people. We know divine order depended on human systems. We know ritual continuity survived through human expertise. What we cannot confirm is whether anyone standing in those courtyards ever felt the larger irony hovering over the incense smoke, that the more perfectly humans served the gods, the more completely they learned how to replace direct divine management with human hands alone. And once the paperwork belongs to you, immortality begins to look surprisingly administrative. That thought follows you out of the temple courtyard and into the scribal room, where memory itself is shaped into wedges and left to dry. If labor, kingship, and temple routine all suggest humanity gradually assuming functions once framed as divine, then writing may be the most unsettling handover of all. Because labor keeps the world moving, rule keeps it ordered, ritual keeps it meaningful, but writing keeps it alive after everyone in the room is gone. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian civilization was one of the earliest great cultures of writing. Most historians agree that cuneiform developed first for administrative purposes and later expanded into literature lore, royal inscription, ritual, text, omen series, hymns, prayers, and myth. Archaeology suggests that writing in ancient Mesopotamia was not a decorative side project for the unusually patient. It was a central instrument of continuity. The evidence we do have points to a society that understood very early that memory becomes more powerful when it can be stored outside the mind. And the moment memory leaves the body and enters clay, something changes. A careful reading might suggest that writing gives humanity a function once associated more naturally with the divine enduring presence. Gods, after all, do not rely on frail human recall in the same way mortals do. They belong to the timeless realm in myth, while people forget age and die. But the tablet complicates that divide. A name pressed into clay can outlast the person who wrote it. An offering list can preserve ritual order across generations. A royal boast can continue shouting long after the king himself has become anonymous dust under someone else's floor. One interpretation is that writing allows human beings to cheat just a little at mortality by building durable memory into the world itself. And durable memory is very close to power. You picture a scribe at work. The reed stylus moves with practiced pressure. Not elegant in the modern sense perhaps, but precise. He copies signs, learned through discipline, repetition, correction, and probably the occasional despairing glance at a teacher who seems personally offended by sloppy wedges. Around him lie tablets in different stages of life. Some still damp, some drying, some already hardened by time or accident, some waiting to be filed away in baskets, rooms, or archives. It is not romantic work exactly, it is focused, technical, and endlessly important. The room smells of clay, fibre, sweat dust, and the tiny private satisfaction of getting a difficult sign right. Most historians agree that scribes occupied a highly valued role in Mesopotamian society. What's broadly accepted is that literacy was specialized and that those trained in writing could serve temples, palaces, legal systems, and scholarly traditions. Historians still argue whether literacy reached more broadly into society than once assumed, but there is no full consensus. The evidence we do have points clearly enough to a class of trained specialists who preserve the machinery of memory. A more cautious explanation could be that writing did not democratize knowledge in the modern sense, it concentrated it. Still, concentration is not the same as weakness. A few human beings trained well enough could preserve what entire generations needed to remember. And that includes the gods. Think about how strange that is. The gods in Mesopotamian tradition are higher than humans, older than cities, woven into the order of existence. Yet their names, hymns, offerings, myths, lineages, and commands are preserved through human writing. If the tablets vanish, much of the usable human memory of divine order vanishes with them. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The gods are not dependent on tablets within their own mythic reality, but human access to the gods increasingly becomes dependent on written tradition. Ritual calendars, incantations, hymns, omen series, and sacred stories all gain durability through clay. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if writing is the moment humanity becomes not merely the servant of divine order, but its archivist, its curator, the keeper of its usable afterlife? That's a possibility, not a certainty. We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is that writing allows humans to preserve structures beyond direct divine presence. A temple can be rebuilt if the rite is remembered. A king can justify his rule if inscriptions survive. A myth can travel across centuries if a scribe copies it faithfully enough. The gods may remain eternal in theology, but on earth their continuity increasingly passes through human hands and human archives. A fringe idea proposes that ancient writing systems encoded hidden warnings from the Anunnaki about humanity's eventual inheritance of their role. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians would treat it very cautiously. A more cautious explanation could be that scribal culture itself made human continuity possible on a scale not previously imaginable. Once stories, laws, rituals, and records could be copied and transmitted, human beings no longer needed constant direct access to divine speech. They had texts, they had precedent, they had stored intelligence. And stored intelligence changes the balance of the world. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian libraries and archives, though often fragmentary to us, now once held substantial bodies of written material. What's broadly accepted is that tablets preserved everything from grain records to epic poetry. That range matters. A careful reading might suggest that writing in Mesopotamia joins the practical and the sacred in the same way temples did. You record a ration, you preserve an omen, you copy a hymn, you mark a boundary, you write a flood story. In every case, the human act of inscription stabilizes reality just a little longer. That stabilization may be the deeper inheritance. First humans take on labor, then they take on administration, then they take on sacred routine. Now they take on memory itself. Not absolute memory, of course. Tablets break, archives burn, signs become obscure, entire meanings slip through gaps in time, like water through reed walls. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Mesopotamian writing did not make people all-knowing, but it did make them durable in a new way. It gave human civilization a means of surviving its own forgetfulness. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the centrality of writing in Mesopotamian civilization and the prestige of scribal culture. The interpretation is that writing may represent a profound transfer of continuity into human hands. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps the gods in these stories begin to recede not only because humans work and rule, but because humans now remember. And once mortals remember well enough, divine immediacy becomes less necessary than divine legacy. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know writing preserved names, rituals, myths, and institutions. We know human beings became the custodians of that memory. What we cannot confirm is whether some ancient scribe smoothing the surface of a fresh tablet in lamplight ever felt the quiet grandeur of what he was doing, not merely recording the world, but inheriting the burden of keeping God's kings and order themselves alive through human skill alone. And that is very close to replacement, even if nobody dares call it that out loud. You feel it most sharply when the sky itself becomes part of the archive, when the old Mesopotamian world lifts its eyes from clay tablets and canal banks and starts searching for meaning in eclipses, liver marks, strange births, dreams, winds, stars, and the stubbornly theatrical behavior of the heavens. Because once humans begin recording not only labor and law, but signs, omens, and celestial patterns, they take on yet another task once imagined as belonging more naturally to divine speech itself. What's broadly accepted is that omen literature became a major part of Mesopotamian scholarly tradition. Most historians agree that ancient Mesopotamian diviners, scholars, and temple specialists compiled extensive collections of signs and interpretations, including celestial omens, terrestrial anomalies, dream reports, and ritual diagnostics. Archaeology suggests that these text traditions were copied and transmitted over long periods, especially in first millennium scholarly settings, though many ideas within them draw on older foundations. The evidence we do have points to a civilization intensely committed to pattern recognition. Nothing is merely strange, it might mean something, and that instinct changes the balance between humans and gods in a very subtle way. A careful reading might suggest that omen texts do not only preserve fear of divine messages, they also preserve human confidence that those messages can be studied, classified, and managed. One interpretation is that divination in Mesopotamia represents a remarkable compromise between uncertainty and control. The gods may still send signs, yes, but trained humans are the ones who collect the signs, compare them to earlier records, interpret consequences, and advise rulers on what to do next. A more cautious explanation could be that omen traditions simply helped ancient societies cope with instability by creating procedures for uncertainty. Still, if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another thought appears. What if the human reading of omens becomes a way of replacing direct divine governance with expert interpretation? That's a possibility, not a certainty. But the more you look at the omen world, the more striking it becomes. You picture a scholar priest working by lamp in a quiet room, the air warm with oil smoke and old clay. He studies a tablet of celestial signs, cross-checking what happened when an eclipse once fell in a certain month, or when an unusual star appeared in a particular quarter of the sky. Nearby lies another text about malformed births, another about liver divination, another about ritual responses. This is not random superstition tossed into the dark and hoped for the best. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian divination was highly systematized. Signs were categorized, preserved, and interpreted within scholarly traditions. In a way that feels almost modern, the heavens became something to observe, index, and compare. Granted, the conclusions are not what your local weather app would produce, but the method has a certain determined seriousness. Most historians agree that celestial omens in particular played a major role in political and royal decision-making. Kings wanted to know whether the sky favored them, warned them, or hinted at danger. What's broadly accepted is that scholars and diviners could recommend rituals, protective measures, or substitute rites in response to troubling signs. Historians still argue whether these practices should be understood mainly as religion, early science, political technology, or all three at once. There's no full consensus because the ancient world did not divide those categories neatly. The same person might observe the moon carefully, write down a pattern, recite a ritual, and advise the throne all before lunch. That overlap matters, because if the gods speak through signs, but humans become experts at decoding and managing those signs, then divine communication is no longer immediate. It is mediated through trained interpretation. The heavens still matter certainly, the signs still carry weight, but human specialists increasingly stand between the divine signal and political action. The king does not simply wait for a god to step down and explain the week. He consults scholars, he reads reports, he performs recommended countermeasures. In practical terms, humanity is learning not only to serve and remember, but to navigate uncertainty using systems of its own making. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if omen traditions preserve the moment when people stopped expecting the gods to rule through obvious presence and instead learned to govern by reading traces, patterns, and probabilities left behind in the world? We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is the sheer effort ancient Mesopotamians invested in turning divine mystery into manageable knowledge. A fringe idea proposes that omen texts hide coded warnings about a coming human succession, as though the Anunnaki or other higher beings already knew their time of direct oversight would end. This theory isn't widely accepted, but it survives because omen collections do feel like whispers from a world where the heavens matter deeply, yet remain frustratingly indirect. A more cautious explanation could be that omen traditions emerge whenever societies need ways to make decisions under uncertainty. Rather than waiting for unmistakable revelation, humans build interpretive systems. And interpretive systems have a habit of becoming their own authority. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian scholars were among the ancient world's most dedicated compilers of precedent. They preserved series commentaries, lexical lists, rituals, and technical traditions with enormous care. A careful reading might suggest that omen literature belongs to the same larger project as scribal culture itself, storing enough pattern and procedure that the world becomes legible or at least less terrifyingly opaque. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know ancient people feared uncertainty. We know they developed learned traditions to address it. What we cannot confirm is whether in doing so they slowly replaced the need for direct divine command with institutionalized human judgment. That judgment is never absolute. Let me rephrase that more carefully. No Mesopotamian scholar would claim to control the gods in any simple sense. The signs remained signs. Outcomes could still surprise. Ritual responses could fail. Kings could ignore advice and regret it dramatically. But the process itself reveals something important. Humans are not standing helpless beneath the sky. They are reading it, sorting it, arguing over it, responding to it, and teaching others how to do the same. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the rich tradition of Mesopotamian omen texts and scholarly divination. The interpretation is that these systems may show humans increasingly managing uncertainty without direct divine rule. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps every eclipse recorded, every liver examined, every strange birth catalogued was part of a much quieter transfer than conquest. The gradual inheritance of the skill of reading the world as if it were a message. And once humanity learns to read the sky well enough to act without waiting for a god to speak plainly, the old order begins to loosen in ways that even the tablets only hint at. And once humanity learns to read the sky well enough to act without waiting for a god to speak plainly, the old order begins to loosen in ways that even the tablets only hint at. That is the moment when modern imaginations tend to get excited, the candles flicker a little brighter. And somebody inevitably says, with great confidence and very little patience, that the Anunnaki were clearly something more than gods. Not symbolic beings, not mythic powers, not divine names moving through ancient religion, but literal visitors, rulers, engineers, or departed overseers who knew humanity would one day take their place. This is where the mist thickens. Most historians agree that in Mesopotamian religion, the Anunnaki are understood as deities or divine beings within a mythological system, not as extraterrestrial administrators with excellent long-term planning. What's broadly accepted is that the name appears in Sumerian and Akkadian traditions with shifting functions depending on time, genre, and context. Sometimes the Anunnaki are associated with the underworld, sometimes with high divine assembly, sometimes with broader cosmic order. The evidence we do have points to a complex religious category, not a single hidden code that modern readers have finally cracked after one dramatic internet video and a suspiciously intense background soundtrack. Still, a fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki were literal superior beings who created humanity as workers and anticipated that humans would eventually replace them. This theory isn't widely accepted, and if the evidence is thin, we'll say so. The evidence here is very thin. It usually relies on speculative readings, mistranslations, selective emphasis, or combining Mesopotamian texts with much later modern assumptions. A more cautious explanation could be that these modern theories are less about what ancient Akkadian texts actually say and more about what modern audiences want ancient texts to mean. Secret origins are seductive. Hidden warnings are exciting. Bureaucratic temple economies are, to be fair, a slightly harder sell at parties. But if we treat the fringe theory as a symptom rather than a conclusion, it becomes interesting in a different way. What if people keep reaching for literal Anunnaki stories because the actual myths already contain a powerful emotional structure? Higher beings create humans for labor. Humans grow numerous, noisy, skilled, and central. Divine action becomes increasingly mediated through institutions, kings, priests, scribes, and scholars. The gods remain real within the tradition, yet human systems begin carrying more and more of the visible burden of order. A careful reading might suggest that the mystery modern readers sense is not entirely invented. It is rooted in the stories themselves, even if the more extravagant conclusions are not. In other words, the appeal of the fringe theory may come from an intuition that the old texts are circling a genuine human theme succession. Not succession in the sense of an obvious prophecy. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The Akkadian texts do not provide a neat hidden line saying, humans shall replace the Anunnaki in fiscal quarter 4. But one interpretation is that these traditions repeatedly stage a transfer of function. Labor moves downward, administration becomes human, kings enact divine order, priests maintain sacred routine, scribes preserve memory, scholars interpret signs. The gods do not vanish, but the world becomes increasingly navigable through human competence. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the reason the Anunnaki remain so haunting in the modern imagination is that the real puzzle has never been whether they physically existed, but whether the myths preserve an old unease about humanity, stepping into roles once imagined as divine? Historians still argue whether later receptions of Mesopotamian myth tell us more about the ancient world or about ourselves. Scholars continue to debate how these stories should be translated, contextualized, and protected from sensational distortion. There's no full consensus on every detail of the divine landscape, but there is broad agreement on one important point. The ancient texts deserve to be read in their own world first. That world is temple-centered, politically layered, ritually dense, and very human in its concerns. It worries about labor legitimacy, flood fertility disorder, kingship, omen, memory, and survival. Those are not trivial concerns. They are the deep structure of civilization. And maybe that is why the myths travel so well. A popular rumor claims that scholars are hiding the real meaning of the Anunnaki from the public. This theory isn't widely accepted, and there is no good evidence for some great academic curtain drawn dramatically across an obvious truth. A more cautious explanation could be that real scholarship is usually slower, less theatrical, and more annoying to conspiracy-minded people because it insists on context, language, genre, and uncertainty. Ancient texts are not vending machines. You do not put in one desire and receive one perfect secret. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We cannot confirm that the Anunnaki were literal beings planning for human succession. We can confirm that Mesopotamian myths repeatedly explore hierarchy, labor dependence, and divine distance. And in that space between what is solid and what is speculative, something meaningful remains. The old stories may not give you a hidden blueprint, but they do ask why the gods needed humans so badly in the first place, and what it means once humans learn to carry the system themselves. Archaeology suggests that ancient religion was never a single voice but a layered chorus of local traditions, political needs, ritual habits, and literary creativity. Most historians agree that the Mesopotamian divine world evolved over time. One interpretation is that the Anunnaki, like many divine categories, became a kind of flexible symbolic language for deeper questions about order, mortality, and authority. If so, then the modern urge to literalize them may miss the richer mystery. Not who they were in a modern science fiction sense, but what they allowed ancient people to think about. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that the Anunnaki belonged to Mesopotamian religious tradition, not a modern secret history manual. The interpretation is that modern fringe theories draw strength from genuine tensions already present in the texts. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps the old myths endure because they touch a nerve still alive in us. The suspicion that those who inherit work memory and interpretation may eventually inherit the world as well. And if that suspicion keeps returning in every age, then perhaps the strangest thing about the Anunnaki is not who they were, but why humanity keeps imagining that the story ends with us standing where the gods once stood. And if humanity keeps imagining that the story ends with us standing where the gods once stood, then the flood is where that imagination grows cold around the edges. Because flood stories are not merely about survival, they are about reset reduction selection, and the uneasy question of what remains when a world has become too full, too noisy, too heavy with its own success. In Mesopotamian tradition, the waters do not simply destroy. They redraw the relationship between heaven and earth. What's broadly accepted is that the Atrahasis tradition, along with related Mesopotamian flood narratives, preserves one of the ancient Near East's most influential stories of divine decision and human survival. Most historians agree that these texts are central to understanding Mesopotamian ideas about human limits, divine frustration, and fragile continuity. The evidence we do have points to a world in which the gods, troubled by humanity's multiplication and disturbance, choose catastrophe, yet one human line survives through warning, preparation, and endurance. Archaeology does not confirm a single universal flood exactly as told in myth, but archaeology suggests that flooding was a real and recurring danger in Mesopotamian life, powerful enough to shape memory and imagination alike. That matters because myth rarely grows from nowhere. Water is both life and threat here. The rivers feed the fields, build the cities, leave the clay, and also remind everybody with very little politeness that order is conditional. A careful reading might suggest that the flood story takes the deepest practical fear of Mesopotamian existence and turns it into cosmic judgment. One interpretation is that the flood marks the moment when divine patience with humanity reaches its limit. A more cautious explanation could be that it dramatizes what ancient people already knew. Civilizations that depend on delicate environmental balance are never as secure as they pretend to be. Still, the flood introduces another layer to tonight's question. If humanity was made to relieve the gods of labor and then became too numerous and troublesome, the flood looks at first like a divine attempt to take back control, reduce the population, restore quiet, reset the terms. It has the feel of a ruler regretting a successful policy. The problem is that the story does not end there. Humanity survives. The line continues. The world is not handed back to the gods as a direct work environment. The burden remains below. The system still depends on people. And that survival may be the real hinge. You picture the storm beginning not as spectacle but as dread. The sky shifts, winds gather over flat land, animals grow restless. The scent of wet clay thickens. Doors are sealed. Somewhere a chosen man, warned in secret, has already begun preparing what must float. The flood in ancient storytelling is not soothing rain, it is overwhelming scale. The order of fields, walls, and roads dissolves into force. Even the gods, in some versions, are unsettled by the destruction they unleash, which is a striking detail in itself. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian flood narratives sometimes portray divine regret, fear, or hunger after the catastrophe. The heavens do not emerge from the event looking serene and all-wise, they emerge looking rattled. Historians still argue whether the flood story is best understood as theological warning, environmental memory, literary inheritance, royal era reflection, or some blend of all four. There's no full consensus, and perhaps there shouldn't be. The story carries too much: fear of water, fear of population, fear of divine anger, fear that civilization is thin and can be washed away. Yet beneath all of that is another fear, quieter and stranger. What if even the flood does not restore the old divine human balance? That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The text does not openly say the gods fail in their effort to reduce humanity. In one sense, they do reduce humanity. The catastrophe works. But a careful reading might suggest that it works only temporarily. The species survives, human life continues, cities return, rituals resume, agriculture begins again. The labor, the memory, the dependence of the world on mortal hands, all of it comes back. The flood does not abolish humanity's role. It proves how difficult that role is to erase. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if survival after the flood is the moment humanity quietly demonstrates that it can continue the world even after divine violence, divine irritation, and divine reset have all passed over it? We are not proving anything tonight, we're following clues. And one clue is that the survivor in flood tradition is not a passive object. He listens, prepares, builds, preserves, and endures. A fringe idea proposes that this preserves the memory of certain humans being selected because they were meant to inherit the post-catastrophe world from withdrawing higher beings. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that flood heroes represent the value of wisdom, obedience, and practical preparation in a world where disaster always lurks near the riverbank. But even that cautious reading leaves a powerful impression. When the divine world turns destructive, human continuity depends on human action, and that changes the emotional balance of the myth. Archaeology suggests that continuity in Mesopotamia often depended on restoration after damage, whether from war, flood, neglect, or dynastic upheaval. What's broadly accepted is that cities and institutions were repeatedly rebuilt. A careful reading might suggest that flood narratives fit this larger cultural pattern. Catastrophe comes, order breaks, survivors reconstruct. In that sense, the flood is not only punishment, it is also a grim recognition that the world below has become durable through human resilience. The gods may judge, the humans rebuild. There is something almost tender in that, though tenderness in Mesopotamian myth tends to arrive wearing muddy boots and carrying trauma in a basket. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the importance of flood tradition in Akkadian literature and the reality of flooding as a profound force in Mesopotamian life. The interpretation is that these stories may reveal deep anxieties about scale disorder and survival. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps the flood is the moment when humanity stops being merely assigned to the world and proves it can carry the world through disaster, even when the gods themselves seem uncertain. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know the gods attempt reduction. We know a human line survives. We know life resumes. What we cannot confirm is whether ancient listeners ever felt the same quiet irony settling after the waters receded, that if the gods truly wished to reassert full control, they still ended by leaving the future in human hands once more. And once the world begins again through mortal survival, the old hierarchy never feels quite as secure. You sense it in the long afterlife of Mesopotamian cities where empire follows. Empire walls rise and crack, dynasties boast and vanish, and the gods remain present in name, even as the visible work of keeping civilization alive falls again and again to human hands. Flood or no flood, reset or no reset, the earthly burden does not travel back upward. It stays here in the dust with us. What's broadly accepted is that Mesopotamian history is marked by repeated cycles of political expansion, fragmentation, recovery and reinvention. Most historians agree that the region saw the rise and fall of city-states, empires, local dynasties and foreign powers across long stretches of time. Archaeology suggests continuity and rupture, living side by side, temples rebuilt on old foundations, royal inscriptions carved over earlier ambitions, administrative habits surviving even when rulers changed. The evidence we do have points to a civilization that knew how to endure instability by rebuilding structure from within. And that pattern matters more than it first seems to. A careful reading might suggest that every collapse in Mesopotamia tested the practical limits of divine rule as experienced on earth. The gods remained invoked, certainly. New rulers still claimed heavenly favor, temples still received restoration, rituals resumed. But the actual work of reassembling order after damage belonged to human institutions, human memory, human labor, human improvisation. One interpretation is that the distance of the gods becomes more visible during crisis, not because belief disappears, but because what saves continuity is almost always mortal effort. You can picture the aftermath of decline. A wall broken in one quarter, a canal neglected long enough to clog, storerooms thin, courtyards quieter than they should be, the old inscription on a foundation stone still promising eternal glory in a tone that history has frankly not honoured very well. Then people return, bricks are made, thresholds are swept, grain is counted again. A priest reopens a rite, a scribe copies what remains. The city, or some reduced version of it, begins the patient work of pretending permanence is natural. Most historians agree that Mesopotamian rulers often legitimized themselves by restoring temples, repairing infrastructure, and reconnecting their rule to ancient sacred order. What's broadly accepted is that reconstruction itself carried political and religious importance. A more cautious explanation could be that rebuilding was both practical necessity and ideological performance. To restore a city was to prove competence. To restore a temple was to present oneself as the proper steward of divine favor. Yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, another thought emerges. What if each restoration, however pious its language, also reveals that human beings have become the indispensable inheritors of a world too fragile for absent gods to manage directly? That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The texts do not say the gods have abandoned Mesopotamia in some dramatic philosophical sense. Divine presence remains a living part of ritual and royal ideology. But the evidence we do have points to a recurring reality. When cities fall into ruin, they are not repaired by heavenly hands descending with celestial brick molds. They are repaired by workers, officials, priests, builders and rulers, all human, all temporary, all terribly necessary. Historians still argue whether the persistence of Mesopotamian institutions through collapse reflects religious resilience, bureaucratic habit, environmental adaptation, or some mixture of all three. There's no full consensus, and that is probably right. Civilizations survive because many things survive together. But one clue keeps returning. The more unstable the political landscape becomes, the more obvious it is that continuity depends on human beings carrying forward systems that are older than any one dynasty and grander than any one ruler's boast. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the repeated collapse of kingdoms is not only a sign of human weakness, but a strange proof of human succession? The gods may remain above the cycle, but on the ground it is people who repeatedly rescue order from the edge of disappearance. A fringe idea proposes that the withdrawing or backgrounded gods in later Mesopotamian experience reflect an ancient memory of literal superior beings stepping away once human civilization could self-maintain after catastrophe. This theory isn't widely accepted. A more cautious explanation could be that as societies matured institutionally, divine action in narrative and ritual grew increasingly mediated by human systems, especially in times of crisis. In that reading, collapse is revealing because it strips away illusion. When everything stable breaks, you learn who truly knows how to put it back together. And again, it is the same answer. The laborers, the builders, the priests, the scribes, the administrators, the kings who are competent enough to last slightly longer than their inscriptions imply. Human beings, in other words, become not just servants of order, but its emergency custodians. Archaeology suggests that ancient cities in Mesopotamia often contain layer upon layer of rebuilding, destruction, reuse, and adaptation. What's broadly accepted is that tells those artificial mounds created by repeated occupation are among the clearest material expressions of long-term continuity through upheaval. A careful reading might suggest that a tell is almost the perfect symbol for tonight's theme. Every generation lives on top of what came before. Every collapse becomes a foundation for another attempt. Every sacred claim must pass through human hands if it is to remain visible at all. The gods may inhabit the highest language of the system, but the ground itself remembers human persistence. That persistence is not glamorous. It smells like dust, plaster, damp reed sweat, and old smoke trapped in brick. It sounds like scraping tools, muttered accounts, ritual recitation, animal movement, and the tiny tap of a stylus on clay. It feels like carrying too much and still rising tomorrow because the canal will not clear itself and the offering cannot place itself on the table. Civilization survives not because immortality steps in every time, but because mortality refuses to stop rebuilding. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the long Mesopotamian pattern of rise, collapse, and reconstruction. The interpretation is that repeated rebuilding may reveal human institutions increasingly bearing the real continuity of the world. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps every ruined city taught the same quiet lesson. If the gods wished to remain central, they had chosen a strange strategy, because again and again the burden of renewal settled into human hands and stayed there. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know Mesopotamian civilizations repeatedly restored themselves after disruption. We know divine legitimacy continued to matter. We know practical continuity depended on mortals. What we cannot confirm is whether ancient people ever felt standing among broken walls and fresh bricks, the same uneasy truth that hovers over you now that every collapse made the gods seem slightly more distant, and humanity slightly more like the only force left to keep the world running. And once you become the one who rebuilds the world, the title of servant begins to sound a little outdated. And once you become the one who rebuilds the world, the title of servant begins to sound a little outdated. By now, the pattern is almost impossible to miss, even if the old tablets never announce it with the kind of dramatic certainty modern readers sometimes crave. Humanity begins as labor. Humanity becomes administration. Humanity carries ritual memory interpretation and recovery. The gods remain present in language worship and imagination, but the visible stewardship of the world settles more and more into mortal hands. If there is an inheritance here, it does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives with ledgers, bread ovens, canal shovels, hymns, and tired people doing tomorrow's work again. What's broadly accepted is that later cultures across the ancient Near East inherited and reworked Mesopotamian ideas in many forms. Most historians agree that myths, divine names, literary motifs, flood traditions, legal habits, and kingship concepts travelled widely through time and influence. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamia's intellectual and religious legacy did not vanish when one dynasty fell or one city lost prominence. The evidence we do have points to continuity through adaptation. Stories moved, ritual concepts shifted, old ideas were taken up, translated, layered, and repurposed by people who no longer lived in the exact same world as the first tellers. And that matters because inheritance itself is part of tonight's theme. A careful reading might suggest that Mesopotamian myths were never only about the beginning of labor or the problem of divine irritation. One interpretation is that they also became ways of imagining stewardship. At first, humanity serves because it must. Later, humanity governs because it can. Later still, humanity preserves because there is no one else on earth who knows how. A more cautious explanation could be that this is simply what civilizations do when they mature. Religious systems become institutional. Sacred obligations become normalized. The extraordinary becomes routine. Yet if we treat it as a possibility rather than a conclusion, a more haunting idea takes shape. What if humanity's replacement of divine function was never rebellion at all, but the long, weary acceptance of responsibility? That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. Mesopotamian texts do not say that humans overthrow the gods and seize the keys to creation like ambitious interns in a cosmic office drama. The gods remain higher, older, and metaphysically greater within the ancient worldview. But what's broadly accepted is that the practical world increasingly depends on mortal continuity. The fields are tended by humans, the kings rule in human bodies, the archives survive through scribes, the rites persist through priests, the cities are rebuilt by workers. The future in every visible civic sense belongs to those who remain on the ground, and that future is heavy. You can feel its weight in the mundane things. In the kneading of dough before dawn, in the chalky feel of dried clay on skin, in the ritual cup that must be washed exactly right, in the reed basket carried one more time across a courtyard, in the quiet dread of a scribe copying damaged signs, knowing that if he misreads them, a thread of memory may fray forever. Civilization is not upheld by revelation alone, it is upheld by repetition. And repetition, though humble, is one of the most godlike powers people ever possess. Historians still argue whether Mesopotamian religion should be understood primarily as a system of submission to divine will or as a collaborative structure in which humans actively maintained cosmic balance. There's no full consensus because the ancient evidence supports both reverence and responsibility. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. We know people saw themselves as dependent on the gods. We also know the same people behaved daily and relentlessly as if the survival of order depended on them. The old myths may not resolve that tension because perhaps they were never meant to. Perhaps the tension is the point. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the deepest Akkadian clue is not that the Anunnaki feared an enemy, but that the divine world in myth slowly makes room for humanity to bear? More than humanity was originally made to bear. A fringe idea proposes that hidden within the old texts is a coded warning that humans would inherit the earth because the gods foresaw their own departure. This theory isn't widely accepted, and the textual support for such a clean prophecy is weak. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient myths often dramatize structural truths rather than literal forecasts. Once a lower order of being is entrusted with essential work, that being becomes central. Once it becomes central, it must develop memory, procedure, and resilience. Once it has those, succession no longer needs to be announced, it is already happening in practice. Archaeology suggests that the material life of civilization is always more fragile than its ideals. Bricks crumble, canals silt up, wooden roofs rot, archives burn, cities shrink, dynasties overpromise. Yet what's broadly accepted is that people keep trying anyway. They restore shrines, recopy texts, measure fields, assign labor, rebuild gates, and rename continuity as tradition. A careful reading might suggest that this stubborn human habit is the true inheritance of divine labor. Not immortality, not absolute power, just the endless charge to keep a threatened world coherent. And perhaps that is more moving than any grand secret, because if we imagine the Anunnaki, or the gods more broadly, as figures who once embodied order from above, then humanity's eventual role is not to become equally dazzling. It is to become equally burdened, to inherit the maintenance, to discover that ruling the world mostly means cleaning up after floodwater, arguing over grain tallies, preserving half-broken hymns, and hoping next season is kinder than the last. Ancient myth strips the glamour from succession in a way modern fantasies rarely do. Replacement, if it exists here, looks less like triumph than duty. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is that Mesopotamian traditions shaped later cultures, and that human institutions carried sacred political and practical continuity across time. The interpretation is that these traditions may reveal a shift from divine service toward human stewardship. The gentle imagination is the thought that perhaps the gods in these old stories knew the truth all along. The only beings capable of replacing divine labor were never the strongest or the most brilliant, but the most stubbornly willing to keep going. And that stubbornness is almost sacred. You lie there now with the fan humming softly, and the ancient world feels less alien than it did at the beginning. Not because the mysteries are solved. They are not. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. We cannot prove that Akkadian texts preserve a secret doctrine of human succession. We cannot confirm that the Anunnaki expected replacement in any direct literal sense. But we can say this much with care: the stories repeatedly imagine humans receiving burdens once carried elsewhere, and repeatedly show that once those burdens arrive, they do not go back. And when a burden stays with you long enough, it stops being borrowed. It becomes your inheritance. And when a burden stays with you long enough, it stops being borrowed. It becomes your inheritance. That is where the old clay trail seems to lead at last, not to a final revelation carved neatly into a tablet, not to some hidden line waiting for modern eyes to triumphantly decode it, but to a quieter and perhaps more human conclusion. The Akkadian world leaves you with fragments, not certainties. The Anunnaki remain part of a complex divine landscape. Humanity remains mortal, vulnerable, noisy, overworked, and forever in need of better ventilation. Yet across the myths, rituals, ruins, and records, the same pattern keeps returning, like the soft scrape of a stylus over damp clay. Work moves downward, responsibility settles downward, memory settles downward, survival settles downward, the visible future settles into human hands. What's broadly accepted is that Akkadian and wider Mesopotamian texts do not plainly declare that the gods knew humanity would replace them one day. Most historians agree that such a literal claim would go beyond what the surviving evidence can securely support. If the evidence is thin, we'll say so. Here it is thin. A careful reading might suggest possibilities, structures, tensions, and emotional undercurrents, but not a secret prophecy with clean edges. The mystery isn't in what we know, but in what we can't confirm. Still, what we can confirm is enough to leave a lingering impression. Archaeology suggests that Mesopotamian civilization depended on human labor at every level. What's broadly accepted is that myths such as Atrahasis imagine humanity created to relieve divine toil. Kingship places human rulers at the operational center of sacred order. Temples rely on human expertise. Writing preserves divine and civic memory through human skill. Omen traditions teach trained people to navigate uncertainty through pattern and precedent. Flood stories show human continuity, surviving divine anger and environmental terror alike. Rebuilt cities reveal mortals carrying forward institutions after collapse. One interpretation is that all these elements taken together create an old and haunting picture of delegated function gradually becoming inherited responsibility. That's a possibility, not a certainty. Let me rephrase that more carefully. The gods are not erased. The divine remains woven through Mesopotamian thought. But the practical world begins to look increasingly human-run. And perhaps that is where the deepest tension lies. Not in some dramatic overthrow, but in the slow realization that once humans are entrusted with the world's maintenance, they become indispensable to its continuation. The old hierarchy may still stand in sacred language yet, on the ground in the field archive, temple and workshop. Humanity has already become the species that keeps everything from falling apart. What if the story is pointing at something else? What if the real meaning of these old Akkadian clues is not that humanity would one day become divine in glory, but that humanity would become divine in burden? That is the kind of thought ancient myth handles very well. It does not flatter you much. It does not say you are special because the stars arranged a grand destiny with your name engraved in cosmic gold. It says more quietly that you may be special because you are the one left holding the system together when everyone else grows distant. It is less a crown than a yoke, less a victory speech than a work assignment, which in fairness does make it feel more historically authentic. Historians still argue whether these texts should be read mainly as theology, social metaphor, literary tradition, or reflections of real institutional life. There's no full consensus, and that is as it should be. Ancient stories are rarely one thing. They are layered, reused, copied, misunderstood, loved, ritualized, argued over, and pushed into new meanings by every generation that inherits them. Some parts are documented, some are interpretation, and some are gentle imagination. The documented part is the world of clay tablets, labor systems, kingship, temples, omen lore, and flood tradition. The interpretation is that these patterns may reveal a gradual transfer of visible responsibility from gods to humans. The gentle imagination is the final whisper of the night. Perhaps the gods did not need to announce humanity's inheritance because the inheritance was always taking shape through use. A fringe idea proposes that the Anunnaki literally foresaw human replacement and embedded warnings in the texts. This theory isn't widely accepted, and most historians would remain cautious. A more cautious explanation could be that ancient Mesopotamian myths preserve a subtler truth, one that does not require secret aliens' hidden codes or a dramatic reveal beneath ominous music. Once a being learns the labor carries, the memory interprets the signs, survives the flood, rebuilds the city, and teaches the next generation that being has already become the practical heir to the world. And maybe that is why these stories still cling to you. Because even now in modern life, much of existence feels like inherited maintenance. You wake, repair, record, preserve, explain, car, rebuild, and continue. You inherit systems older than you, many of them imperfect, some of them beautiful, all of them requiring effort to keep from slipping into disorder. The Mesopotamian imagination knew that feeling well. It gave it gods, floods, tablets, and temple courts. It turned human exhaustion into cosmic drama and human responsibility into sacred structure. But beneath all that old grandeur lies something familiar and very soft-spoken. The world continues because somebody continues it. And for the people who shaped these myths, that somebody was us. So now the night can loosen its grip a little. The tablets can rest. The canal water can darken into stillness. The temple lamps can burn lower. The scribes can set aside their styluses. The kings and priests and labourers and bakers and builders can drift back into the great hush where ancient lives go when the telling is done. You do not need to solve their mysteries tonight. You do not need to pin every debated line into one final meaning. We'll keep the solid ground separate from the mist, and that is enough. You can simply lie here for a moment and let the old world settle around you. Let the clay cool in your imagination. Let the reeds bow near the river. Let the dust soften on ancient thresholds. Let the storehouses, courtyards, and temple roofs blur into moonlit outlines. Let the noise of humanity, that old troubling sound, become gentler, now less like a disturbance and more like a lullaby carried across time. Somewhere far back in the dark, the first workers are laying down their burdens. Somewhere after them, the first humans are taking those burdens up. And somewhere after that, in all the ages that follow, the same quiet exchange continues, not with triumph, not with fanfare, but with persistence. A loaf baked, a wall repaired, a name remembered, a story copied, a flooded world endured, a morning begun again. And now as the air grows softer and the night thins into that peaceful place between thought and sleep, you can let the question remain open just as the old tablets leave it. Did the gods know humanity would replace them one day? Perhaps not in the loud, literal way modern rumours like to imagine. Perhaps only in the slower, sadder, steadier way that old myths understand best. That the ones who do the work, keep the memories, survive the disaster, and rebuild the world are the ones who quietly inherit it. So the clay returns to stillness. The lamp flame shrinks. The last stylus mark dries, and the ancient world, having handed over all it can, lets you rest.